Okay, welcome to this short preview video for Book 20. We have been waiting since Book 13, when Odysseus arrived back home in Ithaca, for a violent sort of climactic set of moments. And we're almost there, and we're at Book 20. We're not quite there yet. Book 20 centers on several things, not the least of which is a series of prayers by different characters. And Homer's two epic poems have really interesting sort of diverse positions on prayer. Clearly, piety, following the will of the gods, involves praying to them and offering sacrifices to them and listening to their advice. But obviously, various gods are being prayed to for various things, sometimes contradicting each other. So it's a pretty complicated business. So what I do with my students, what I think is a good idea to do before Book 20 is we've already had several predictions. So right now, you know Odysseus's hopes, sorry about the missing apostrophe, and plans. Write about what you think is going to happen if you've never read this before, particularly in a book that Emily Wilson titles The Last Banquet, which seems to be a bit of a spoiler. Why is this the last one, right? But anyway, make some predictions. It's less, again, as I always say, it's less about being right, and it's more about sort of sitting inside the patterns of the story and trying to imagine what's happening next. That's a good thing to do. So if you go to the very beginning, we have Odysseus still as a beggar. And in line 1, it says, Odysseus was lying at the entrance on an untreated ox hide, over which he heaped a pile of fleeces from the sheep the suitors sacrificed. So on every level, he has not great accommodations. The ox hide isn't treated, which it would have been if he was royalty. And the fleeces that he's sitting on were probably soaked in blood, and they were the ones from the sheep that the suitors had sacrificed. And it says, he lay there but did not sleep. His mind was plotting how to kill the suitors. He's been obviously thinking about this for quite some time. This is how the previous chapter began as well. And then, so it begins with more poverty, marginalization. And again, this idea that he can't sleep is definitely worth thinking about, writing about. There's probably some very just basic human elements to it. But I don't know, it's coming up over and over again. So I play this video for students. This is Emily Wilson, and I'm really excited. She's working on a translation of the Iliad, which I'm excited for. But she has the introduction to her book, particularly if you're a teacher or if you're a student writing some research on this epic. Her introduction is worth buying the entire book for. And she has, in podcast interviews and in the introduction, some really interesting ideas. So the next line of the poem says, then the girls who had been sleeping with suitors slipped outside, giggling and happy to be out together. Innocent enough line in Emily Wilson's. But when Emily Wilson talks about Penelope and Odysseus's slave girls, she makes it very clear in her introduction and in podcast interviews that the word in Greek is slaves, right? These are property. So what's interesting is in several of the other translations, the Fagles translation, the Fitzgerald translation, I think the Lattimore translation, bitches and sluts are often the term used here as a moral sort of judgment, that these aren't just girls, that they've behaved badly, and we're going to call them out for that. Emily Wilson has some really interesting ideas about how females are often called dog or bitch. And when you really want to insult someone in this world, using dog imagery is the way to do it. And Odysseus calls the suitors dogs, and she makes the claim that it wasn't so much that you were, ugly or something like that. It was that you kind of fed your impulses on the spot. You were kind of just all emotion, no reason. I mean, it was a really harsh thing to say about somebody. But she says that calling these girls sluts or bitches would be like calling a microwave oven or your car a slut or bitch. That a slave is property. A slave doesn't have agency or choice. And that really does change the passage. right? Because then it puts the evil on the suitors and not these girls who can't make the choices. And if the suitors are really evil, even in the way that they're unfaithful here, that sort of maybe will highlight some aspects of the climax. So I just wanted to point that out. And if you're just reading this poem for the first time, you're probably not worried about the nuances of translation. But just to know, I mean, occasionally to sort of look under the hood of the poem in a way, and to know that the person who's responsible for this book thinks about what the words mean, right? And thinks about the difference in your reading experience if she calls someone slaves or sluts, right? A slave is a fact of someone's life. A girl is a fact of someone's life. A slut, bitch, or whore, which is sometimes translated here, is a moral judgment. So I just think that's interesting. Okay, so if you go to line 33, we get a rare moment. Athena says, "Why are you wide awake, unlucky man?" Even Athena's noticing that he's not sleeping. And then in the next paragraph, right around line 36, clever Odysseus said, "Goddess, yes, all that's true, but I'm wondering how I can attack those upstarts who are always clustered together while I'm alone." And then, again, mark your book up when you read these passages out loud. And then when you read the entire book, the entire chapter, you already have some passages marked up. Odysseus says this, and we just get very few moments that are this clear. "My biggest fear is this. If you and Zeus help me to kill them, then what?" Odysseus is a chess player, just like when he was in the cave, right? I'm not going to kill the Cyclops because then we won't be able to move the rock and we'll all die. He sees 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. He says here, okay, let's imagine I kill all the suitors. Then what? I'm going to be punished for that, right? Just killing 108 people. So not surprisingly, she promises to protect him, but I just think it's interesting that he states his fear so bluntly. So there's a few prayers that stand out. And I'm not going to read this entire one, but Penelope prays to Artemis, who's a female goddess, who, when she shoots you with her arrow, you die. So here's another famous example in literature where someone is in such a dark place that they're thinking about and wishing for a kind of death. And she says on line 78, this is the top of page 448, "May the gods annihilate me just like them." So annihilate is I don't know what the word is in Greek, but the Latin word means, doesn't just "I want to die," it's "I want to be made nothing." It's a really strong word. Or "May Artemis strike me dead with my gaze fixed upon Odysseus." And I would definitely mark this next line. "Let me not make a lesser husband glad." You know, when you're married to Odysseus, it's hard to go to the next guy. And she's like, I don't want to even entertain somebody else in my life. And then she herself talks about being sleepless. So I would mark up that whole prayer from 60 to 89, Penelope's kind of state of mind right now. And even though we're so focused on Odysseus, Penelope is really as important as a character. So pay attention to her in her life as well. Odysseus, a short prayer starting on line 98, down that same page. "O Father Zeus, O gods, if you've brought me back on purpose across dry land and sea to my own home after you made me suffer all that pain, let someone inside speak in words of omen, and Zeus display another sign outside." Zeus knows how to pray. He doesn't pray for ambiguities. He prays for clear signs. I want a sign that I'm home for a reason. And I want 2 signs, actually. He says, I want a sign inside the building, and I want to hear it or see a sign outside. So we get a huge thunderclap outside, and that's obviously Zeus's presence, right? And then an eagle. Okay, so it says we get thunder here. That's what we get here. Then a female servant in the very next couple of stanzas shows up. And this is her prayer. So I think this is interesting because we're going from the king and the queen's prayer to a slave's prayer. Watch this, line 113. "Zeus, king of gods and humans," very similar to to Odysseus. "You made thunder boom from a cloudless sky, a sign for someone." So she's responding actually to the answer to Odysseus's last prayer. Fulfill a poor slave's prayer that this will be the last day the suitors dine in style here in the old king's house. My knees are sore from this exhausting work of grinding grain for them. I pray this is their final meal. I just want to point out it's important that this person has a voice in the poem. This person talks to the greatest god in the poem. And this person comes after the king and the queen. So it has sort of a place of prominence, which is really, really worth talking about. So if you go to line 130, we have Telemachus. Telemachus gets to speak, and Eurycleia, the nurse, responds. Telemachus is mad that it seems like Penelope has left the beggar, who we know is Odysseus, and Telemachus knows Odysseus, out sort of on the front steps and not given him really great accommodations. And Eurycleia kind of clarifies, what had just happened. Eurycleia also, she's someone that stood up to Penelope earlier in the book, earlier in the epic. And in line 149, this is just a little easy to forget moment, but they have to prepare, for the day and for the banquet. Line 149, now hurry, you girls, sweep the floors and sprinkle them. Spread purple cloths across the chairs. You others sponge the tables. Wash the double-handed cups and bowls. And you go fetch the water from the spring. Be quick. They'll be coming soon. It's a festival for all of them today. They listened carefully and followed orders. So I just want to point out, I'm a high school teacher and we talk a lot about leadership, but an objective fact about leadership, we don't have to like this, but it's a fact. You're only a leader if people are following you. Otherwise, you're just a person, right, who thinks things. You can be a nice person, a good person, but leaders are followed. That's sort of by necessity. And even though she's a servant, her team of girls just hops to right when she gives commands. There's some debate. The goat herder Melanthius sort of attacks the beggar Odysseus, and interestingly, there's a cowherd who's sort of another good guy, Philotius. And if you go to line 193, it's on page 452. This is interesting. He says, "Who is this new guest who has arrived? Who are his people? Where is his native land, his ancestry? Poor man, he has a kingly look." So that's weird. And it's just interesting to point out that the two people who seem to recognize Odysseus, the three characters who recognize Odysseus in the most instinctive way is Argos the dog, Eurycleia his slave nurse, and Philotius who takes care of cows. Just pointing that out, something incredibly worth talking about. Then in line 241, we get another omen, and we know eagles are signs of Zeus's presence. The suitors are about to plan and to discuss killing Telemachus. He's in their way. It says the suitors were planning how to kill Telemachus, but then an eagle flew high on their left, holding a wild dove. Amphinomus said to them, "Friends, this plan of ours, this murder will fail, so let us think about our banquet." And they all agreed. I think it's worth talking about why they read the omen and follow it. That's worth talking about. Then go to line 299. It's the very top of page 356. Someone hurls an ox foot from the basket. So this is, they've slaughtered animals. So there's an ox foot literally in a basket, and guy hurls it towards Odysseus. So now there's this motif in the poem, this recurring theme of people throwing stuff at the beggar who we know is Odysseus. Odysseus ducks and creepily smiles at the person who did this, Siseppus. Telemachus says, right in that second paragraph on page 246, "You were lucky you failed to hit the stranger. He avoided the blow himself. I would have thrust my sword right through your belly, and your father would have held your funeral and not your wedding. So from now on, all you should stay in check here in my house." Okay, so that's a new guy. And at the end of that paragraph, just skip to 318. He says to these suitors, "It would be better to die than to have to watch you suitors acting so horribly, abusing strangers, dragging the house girls through my home, molesting them. And I circled the word molesting because generically it means to bother. But I think what Emily Wilson's emphasizing here is that the suitors are evil and the girls don't have any choices because they're literally property, like I said, like a microwave oven or a car. So that's being emphasized here. So really pay attention to the man Telemachus has become. Really violent, really threatening, still sad, but this is a very different man than the man we met earlier on. Then we may have forgotten Theoclymenus. He is the murderer prophet on the run that Telemachus rescues. And we forget he's there, right? So he is, listening to all of this and watching all this happen. In line 346, weird thing. So go to line 346. It's on page 457. Athena turned the suitors' minds. And this is one of those difficult moments where you have to ask, are the suitors at fault if it's a god making them think things? And I wrestle with that. Athena turned the suitors' minds. They laughed unstoppably. They cackled and they lost control of their own faces. Plates of meat began to drip with blood. This is like an LSD trip here. Get ready. Their eyes were full of tears and they began to wail in grief. So weird, delusions almost. The prophet Theoclymenus addressed them. Listen to this. What awful thing is happening to you? Your faces, heads, and bodies are wrapped up in night. Your screams are blazing out like fire. The ornate palace ceilings and the walls are spattered with your blood. The porch is full of ghosts, as is the courtyard, ghosts descending into the dark of Erebus. The sun has vanished from the sky, and gloomy mist is all around. So all the suitors laugh at him and make fun of him. And right around line 365, it says, the prophet answered. This is Theoclymenus again. Eurymachus, I will not ask for guides. I have good eyes and ears and feet. My mind is working perfectly, and I'm leaving. I sense some evil coming for you all who sit here in Odysseus's house, tormenting and oppressing other people. Not one of you will get away. Underline that last line. So another prophet. We have Athena saying things. We have prayers now. We never know whether gods are going to listen, right? And the gods all want different things to happen. Think Zeus never really supported Odysseus. We know Poseidon hates Odysseus. We know Athena loves Odysseus. So it's not like, in scripture when you're praying to one god. This is a differently complicated sort of event, prayer. And then we have prophecy. And the bottom line of Theoclymenus' prophecy is all the suitors will die. Not one of you will get away. And then go to line 376. We'll finish. And think about where the end of book 20 is leading us. The suitors say to Telemachus, what awful luck you have with visitors. Here's this dirty beggar always wanting more food and wine, who's unskilled in farm work or fighting, a mere burden on the earth. I don't want to get political. And Emily Wilson always says, the point of the Odyssey isn't to encourage us to have a certain immigration policy in America. But I can't help but to think of something human and something timeless every time we hear about the treatment of strangers and immigrants, which again, is the same word in Greek. That the problem here isn't only that they're strangers and immigrants, is that they're not skilled, right? Right? These aren't the best people from these communities. They're burdens. The other one just stood there prophesying. Now listen, I propose a better plan. Pack up your strangers on a boat as slaves, send them to Sicily and make a profit. That's what the suitors do. Just get rid of these aggravations. And then listen to this last part. Telemachus ignored the suitors' words and watched his father quietly, still waiting for when they should attack the shameless suitors. They're both showing great restraint. The beautiful Penelope had wisely set up her chair to face them, and she listened to what each man was saying. They'd killed numerous animals and made their banquet with laughter, but no dinner time could be less welcome than the one the mighty man and goddess would soon bring them in revenge, because they started it and wronged him first. So that's an example, another Greek term you see in a lot of epics. The line, no dinner time could be less welcome. That's called understatement. And the fancy word for that, if you want to impress folks, is litotes. I write in the margins, Litotes. So rather than saying, these suitors are dead meat, they're going to have a terrible dinner time, the poet says, no dinner time could be less welcome. It's an understated way of saying something. So the opposite would be like an exaggeration or hyperbole, right? So this is the opposite of that. But it's a really creepy end to book 20. Fortunately, the suitors don't have a copy of the Odyssey, right? That would change everything. Anyway, I hope this preview helped you, and good luck with book 20.